To me, the cult that has formed around Greta Thunberg speaks to the desperation of the environmental movement to be taken seriously. It's also a calculated move by those pushing their agenda to silence any criticism. I mean, how can you possibly criticise a schoolgirl and one on the autism spectrum at that? Surely her oppression points keep us safe from all criticism unless you're a black disabled lesbian. Thankfully, though, I'm immune to the oppression Olympics, so I think if you're going to put yourself out there on public display and make bold, unsupported claims, you're open to the same criticism as anyone else. Now, I'm not going to play the whole speech from the UN Climate Action Summit, and it would be incorrect to characterise what she says as a speech anyway. It's mostly an emotional-filled rant with hyperbolic claims and catastrophic end-of-world scenarios. And to play the whole 5 minutes would give the false impression that she says something important. So I'm just going to give a few examples of why Greta Thunberg should be ignored and just go back to school where she belongs.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?
Well, at least we agree on the first part. You should be back at school on the other side of the ocean learning something useful. But that second part is interesting. She claims that you all, by which she means the adults, come to us young people for hope. Now, maybe in a decade or so, Greta will be old enough to realise how ridiculous that statement is. We don't come to young people for hope. In fact, when we look at young people, we see despair. Because whilst most of you may possess potential, you haven't yet had enough experience to actually contribute anything meaningful to society. That's why when you get out of school and graduate from university, most of you will start jobs where you will be the resident shit kicker, because you don't know anything. Your job is to listen and learn, and then when you actually know something, someone might start listening to you. Until then, put your placards down and shut the fuck up.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones.
Well, again, there is a grain of truth in that. You are one of the lucky ones. You won the civilizational lottery. You were born at the best time in the history of humanity up to this point. You are the most comfortable, safe generation to ever walk the face of the earth. But if you want to blame someone for the fact that you spent your childhood in a constant state of distress, blame your parents. After all, they're the ones that decided to start frightening the shit out of you with alarmist rhetoric when you were 8 years old.
People are suffering. People are dying.
What sort of ridiculous statement is that? People are always dying and suffering. The question is, are they dying and suffering at disproportionate rates because of climate change? The answer, of course, is no. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Deaths from weather-related disasters are down 95% from a century ago. Not because the weather is more amenable, but because we have less poverty. According to the World Bank, over 1 billion fewer people live in poverty today than in 1990. And because we live in societies that are more resilient to weather effects. Thanks, ironically, to a fossil fuel-driven economy that has allowed the types of innovations that have lifted billions out of poverty and made the environments in which we live safer.
Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
How can you look at this girl with anything but pity and contempt for those that have filled her head with Malthusian doomsday scenarios? None of what she says has any relationship to reality, but the adults in this particular room cheer her on like lemmings.
The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today, that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years.
So basically, Greta wants to cut carbon emissions to zero by 2028. This is the only acceptable course of action according to her, or at least gives you the highest probability of preventing, in her words, setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. But what does a zero emissions world actually look like? Well, probably the dawn of a new dark age, as Bjorn Lomborg stated in a couple of tweets. Greta, right. If you want 1.5 degrees Celsius, you must shut down world in 8 years. But should we? That is a political question, not a science one. Just like science tells us if you want no traffic deaths, you must set speed limit at 5 miles per hour. Whether you want that world is a political question. Here is her quote from the IPCC. We have about 420 gigatons of carbon dioxide left for 1.5 degrees Celsius used in around 2028. Then we have to cut off all fossil fuels. Without 81% of the world's energy, it will be cold, dark, and backbreaking. Half the world will die because fossil fertilizers produce 50% of the food. And as he went on to write in the Globe and Mail, ending global fossil fuel use by 2028 is a flawed plan because green energy is simply not in a place in its development where it can take over what fossil fuels leave behind. A hard-by-hook or crook transition would cause a real global catastrophe, sending most of us back into back-breaking poverty. That's why developing countries especially want more fossil fuel power, not less. They want to lift more people into comfortable lives. So Greta's brave new world of zero emissions by 2028 would plunge us into a new dark age. And unlike Greta's rhetoric, that's not hyperbole. Wiping out almost 4 billion people would be close to an extinction event.
You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
Lomborg goes on. Finally, Ms. Thunberg tells us that if we don't cut off fossil fuels by 2028, the young generation will never forgive us. This, however, is reflective of a blinkered first world view. When the United Nations asked 10 million people around the world what they prioritise, they highlighted 5 issues: health, education, jobs, corruption and nutrition. In some, they care about their kids not dying from easily curable diseases, getting a decent education, not starving to death. Climate came last of 16 choices. That's not because it's unimportant, but because for most of humanity, other issues are much more pressing. The problem is that climate is increasingly trumping all other issues. A third of all development aid, for instance, is now spent addressing climate, in direct defiance of the priorities of the world's poor. So I guess all there is left to say is, how dare you to the Malthusian climate alarmists for exploiting the emotional fragility of a child to push your own agenda. But thankfully, most of the world isn't buying it. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.